Some say that the Cold War shaped the 21st century. Indeed, much of the major events of the 21st century, for example, decolonization and the conflict in the Middle East, nuclear proliferation, were intertwined in the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. The People's Republic of China, established in 1949, and the Republic of Cuba, established in 1961, are two of the only few communist states left in the modern world of the 21st century. While Cuba remains an isolated remnant of the Cold War, China is the world's most important rising global power. What are some characteristics of these nations? How close was it with the USSR? Was it a part of the Third World or the Second World? And what consequences does these have? How did their respective allegiances in the Cold War influence their position in the world today? To understand these, we will have to look at it through two different historical lenses. One is the Cold War struggle, and another one is the process of decolonization.
Both China and Cuba were originally part of the Second World and aligned with the Soviet Union. However, after disagreement with the Soviet Union, China, with its great potential and increasing power, was able to stay independent from the Soviet Union, while for Cuba, it remained a reliable ally for USSR because of its economic dependency. China's subsequent position in international affairs was neither part of the Second World or the Third World, attempting to carve up its own sphere of influence. The rise of communist China created a multipolar aspect to the Cold War and eventually saw both the United States and the USSR trying to gain China's support in their rivalries. On October 1st, 1949, Mao proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China. As the only other major communist country at the time, China and the USSR were naturally allies against the capitalist world. As early as December 1949, Mao asked Stalin for economic assistance, to which Stalin agreed. Mao also declared his lean to one side policy in the Cold War, showing that China was firmly aligned with the USSR. The Soviets provided an extensive aid program to China in the 1950s, intended to develop China's economy along Soviet lines. It provided aid for 156 major industrial projects concentrated in mining, power generation, and heavy industry. They taught Chinese workers how to operate factories and increase production of basic commodities such as coal and steel. As a result, the early Chinese economy was heavily based off Soviet standards. However, in the beginning, the alliance between China and the USSR was based on equal grounds, as China gained its state sovereignty and the USSR actually suffered loss during the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship.
As Mao thought that the right of use of the China Far East Railway, the South Manchuria Railway, and the Port Arthur and Dalian refers to Chinese state sovereignty, he required the Soviet Union to return these interests to China, and this was a crucial part of the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship. Joseph Stalin initially refused this treaty, but finally made a great concession and agreed with the terms. On December 1956, a small force of revolutionaries led by Fidel Castro landed in Cuba. After a long civil war, Fulgencio Batista left, and Castro's forces marched on Havana on January 1959. Contrary to popular misconception, Castro was not a communist and did not have immediate ties to the Soviet Union. He was a liberal reformer. In fact, he was not even associated with the Communist Party of Cuba. Initially, Castro even looked to the US for aid to develop Cuba's economy. He also announced in the UN that non-alignment was the only realistic position for developing states in the Cold War. However, Castro was pushed to form ties with the USSR by the US policy of containment of communism. Many of Castro's liberal reforms, such as his plans for agrarian reform and the nationalization of land in Cuba, were seen by the US as communist and harmful to US interests. In line with his New Look policy, Eisenhower began to order bombings of Cuba. Tensions escalated in the 1960s when Castro ordered the US-owned oil refineries in Cuba to process Soviet crude oil, which was cheaper than oil purchased from Venezuela. When the US refused, Castro nationalized the US oil companies. Eisenhower then suspended the Cuban sugar quota in the US, to which Castro responded by nationalizing almost all US-owned companies in Cuba, so the US placed an embargo on virtually all trade to Cuba. The US actions caused Castro to turn towards communism. In 1960, Castro signed a trade agreement with Stalin, which gave Cuba $100 million of credit for the purchase of industrial equipment, and the USSR agreed to purchase 2 million tons of sugar a year. By 1961, Castro had established diplomatic and trade relations with every communist country. There were many reasons for China's divide with the USSR, a major one being the Formosan Straits crisis. China wanted to pursue a policy of territorial expansions. It decided to annex the Quemoy and Matsu Islands from Formosa. China began to shell the island of the Quemoy. The US seeing this threatened to bomb the Chinese military forces and to use the atomic bomb. Mao requested Russian support over this, but Khrushchev did not do so. Without any support from Russia, the Chinese stopped its expansion. This event eventually tarnished Sino-Soviet relations. The sign of a conflict of interest between Cuba and the USSR came following the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Castro came to believe that Stalin had used Cuba in its global contest with the US. After a failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, Castro appealed to the USSR for protection. Khrushchev responded by placing several intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Cuba. When the US discovered the existence of nuclear missiles in its own backyard, the two superpowers very nearly resorted to nuclear war near Cuba. While China increasingly splitting off from the USSR and began to develop its own independent foreign policy, Cuba did not. The Cuban Missile Crisis did create Castro's distrust of the USSR, and Castro attempted to strengthen Cuba's power in Latin America by exporting revolution to neighboring countries in order to create a buffer against the United States. However, when Castro's attempts to spread communism to the Dominican Republic in 1959 and Bolivia in 1965 were unsuccessful, Castro has no choice but to reaffirm its alliance with the USSR for protection. For example, in 1968, Castro publicly supported the Warsaw Pact's invasion of Czechoslovakia. This shift began more intensified after Cuba began to experience serious economic problems in 1969 and 1970, and became even more dependent on the Soviet aid. Therefore, Cuba became a much more reliable ally for the USSR. Because both of them aren't a part of the Warsaw Pact and were only the USSR's allies outside of the communist bloc in Europe, their relationships with Russia is based on strategic conveniences. Cuba's position is a great threat to the United States and allowed the USSR to balance out the United States' advantage of having Turkey as one of their allies, while China, with its great potential, can aid Russia in the spreading of communism. China and Cuba both suffered from a long history of colonialism and imperial domination of other countries, mainly Japan, but also other European nations for China, and Spain for Cuba. These made them belong in the same historical context than other former colonized countries. Although Cuba became independent from the Spanish colonizers in 1902, it was no long until the United States installed a cooperative dictator, Batista. This is yet again another form of imperialism, as the US is indirectly controlling Cuba. This is why the Cubans reject this and follows Fidel Castro in order to be free from the US control. During the Korean War, China wanted to preserve a North Korean communist state, but not to dominate it. Instead, the Chinese wanted North Korea to serve as a buffer between Manchuria and the US dominated South Korea. This being said, its intervention in North Korea was purely out of self-decision and strategic protection against capitalism, as the USSR previously stated that it will not involve in the actual conflict. This is an evidence of the Chinese getting more powerful and influential. Right from the beginning of its formation, the People's Republic of China supported the decolonization movements in Africa and the Pacific. Furthermore, at the 1955 Bandung Conference, China wanted to become the leader of the Third World. China also tried to strengthen its ties with African nations by the extensive tour led by its premier, Zhou Enlai. Furthermore, China also sent experts, such as railway experts, to help African nations to build their own infrastructure. Khrushchev denounced Stalin and his policies and subsequently set about implementing post-Stalinist economic reforms. Mao believed that Khrushchev was not adhering to Marxism-Leninism, but was instead a revisionist, altering his policies from basic Marxist-Leninist concepts, something Mao feared will allow capitalists to eventually regain control of the country. From these evidences, we can see that China is trying to gain its own sphere of influence and attempted to gain more recognition as it got involved in other nations' affairs such as the North Korean War and its growing friendly relationship with African nations, which can provide China with great natural resources.
The events in Mao's China and Castro's Cuba were to become immersed in the politics of the Cold War. According to historian Joshua Cole, because the USSR and USA couldn't confront each other directly, they were strongly attempted to gain power by supporting proxies or groups they favored in other parts of the world. According to A.G. Hopkins' globalization theory, decolonization must be viewed in the context of globalization, and this is indeed true when we view the fate of China and Cuba today. With the increasing interconnectedness and interdependence of the global economy, in order to be competitive, countries must embrace global trade to have cheaper production costs. As a result of its huge labor force and rapid industrialization, China has now developed into the second largest economy, whilst Cuba remains relatively backward due to its adherence to communist policies. So, to what extent are China and Cuba still communist today? Currently, both China and Cuba are officially considered to be single-party socialist states, with the Communist Party as their leading party. Economically, Cuba has been balancing between remaining socialist and extreme government control. Only recently, in 2011, after the Communist Party Congress, did the Cuban government begin to adopt new economic reforms, from allowing private ownership and foreign investment. In China, economic movements since the 1970s have moved away from the original collectivized economy, and China has begun opening up and allowed for private ownership of property. However, the Chinese government still has a lot of control over its economic situation through methods like state-owned enterprises. Politically, the communist element in both China and Cuba still remains. However, the economic development of China and Cuba since the 1960s shows they're straying away from the ideals of communism toward capitalism. Which brings us to the question, to what extent is communism a viable model for a country? As we define, communism advocates for class war in order to lead to a society where all property is publicly owned and each person works and is paid according to their needs. However, communism sometimes can be an unviable model for a country. First of all, economically in the past, communism has been very hard to achieve because it can slow down the economy and make it ineffective in growth. Both in the USSR and China, communist economic movements included collectivization and the Great Leap Forward. Instead of shifting society toward communism, it resulted in the deaths of millions due to poverty, which is why in recent years the communist economic model has shifted towards socialism, a model that allows for private property and individualism, but yet the majority remains controlled by the government. Socially and politically, communism is sometimes often associated with authoritarianism, dictatorship, and even totalitarianism, where the government is heavily involved in the lives of individuals. For instance, extreme propaganda and censorship was commonly used by the Chinese government up to 1976 during the period under Mao Zedong, where it shaped the perspective of the citizens and resulted in a tragic period for almost a generation of people. In conclusion, while Mao's China and Castro's Cuba were originally part of the Second World and aligned with the Soviet Union, after estrangement with the USSR, China, with its great potential and increasing power, was able to stay independent from the Soviet Union, while Cuba remained a reliable ally for the USSR because of its economic dependency. After the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, both China and Cuba have had to adapt to the capitalist world. While communism as a social, political, and economic ideology remains a shining ideal with its promise of the elimination of class, it is currently not a viable model for communism to work, because for communism to work, it has to be a global phenomenon. This is due to the conflicting economic structure of communism and capitalism, as one promotes free trade and the other promotes state allocation of resources.